Great. So hello everyone, I'm Sarah Ann Gresham and I'm the co-founder of Intersect and a PhD candidate in women's gender and sexuality studies. I'm really excited to have you all here today with us, along with Dr. Jobson and my team member, Lucia. If you can say howdy in the chat and let us know where you're coming from, what country you're joining us from, that would be wonderful. So we've been on hiatus since early last year, but we're happy to be back and we will be uploading more content from previous teach-ins to YouTube and to our socials, so please stay tuned. We'll also share a post-session handout containing reflections from this teach-in and definitions of keywords and concepts. So a little bit about Intersect. Intersect Antigua-Barbuda is a Caribbean feminist collective which agitates for gender justice and Caribbean liberation. We are committed to different arrangements of relationality and of being human that depart from the atomizing force of capitalism and from heteronormativity. And we embrace Jamaica Kincaid's imperative of cultivating a demanding relationship to history that indicts colonial patriarchy, capitalism, and nationalism. We invite you to delve into our website, intersectantigua.com, where we've curated approximately 200 essays, stories, poems, art, and photography across a range of themes for our Caribbean Feminist Stories project. From our Artist in Residence program to our teach-in series to our Caribbean Feminist Healing Justice program, we invite you to join us to co-create Caribbean feminist knowledge and freedom dreams. This year, Intersect Antigua-Barbuda continues its teach-in series by leveraging Caribbean feminisms as a primary antagonism against US imperialism and fascism by figuring gender, class, race, and other axes of power into critical thought and praxis in response to the United States' violent incursions into Venezuela, its boat strikes upon the people of the Caribbean, its crushing economic onslaught and threats against Cuba, and its commitment to imperiling the people of Haiti. Joining us in this work is our very talented resident artist, Lucia Murray, who designs all of our flyers and all of our materials. Lucia, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sarah. And hey, everyone. I'm Lucia, also known as Lam. As Sarah said, I'm Intersect's resident artist, and outside of this, I am a freelance visual artist and writer. I'm responsible for a lot of the art and graphics that you see Intersect put out, such as the flyer behind Sarah. And yeah, I also aid Sarah in bringing sessions such as this one to life. I'm really happy to be in this space with you guys today, and I'm really, really looking forward to today's discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucia. Now I'm going to introduce us to our distinguished guest and speaker, Professor Ryan Cecil Jobson. So Dr. Jobson is assistant professor in the departments of anthropology and race, diaspora and indigeneity at the University of Chicago. He holds a PhD in African American Studies and Anthropology from Yale University, which he earned in 2017. His research and teaching engage questions of energy and extractivism, states and sovereignty, climate and crisis, race and capital in the Caribbean and the Americas. His first book, The Petro-State Masquerade, Oil, Sovereignty, and Power in Trinidad and Tobago, was published by the University of Chicago Press in December 2024. He is currently at work on 2 subsequent manuscripts, an intellectual biography of the Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James entitled C.L.R. James and the Question of Power, and a collection of essays on anthropological theory and method in an era of climate extinction. Dr. Jobson serves on the editorial committee of Small Acts and as co-editor-in-chief of Transforming Anthropology. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jobson to discuss his essays, book chapter, and other offerings that put Caribbean political economy and Caribbean feminist thought in conversation. From insights on the big, small place of Trinidad and Tobago to its moves to climate innocence through the artifice of the masquerade, which obscures the violent origin story of the nation state and the economic uncertainty and impermanence of oil and gas, to foregrounding the self-determination of the Essequibo people in South America, to critiquing the maintenance of socialist programs through extractive capitalist investments, Dr. Jobson's rigorous interventions are piercing, percussive, and urgent to our contemporary political moment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jobson.
Hi, good night. And thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Thank you, Sarah and Lucia, for having me today. This is very exciting. I'm really thrilled to be holding this as a teach-in. And I'll just say before I sort of share my slides and begin this discussion, there'll be some moments for sort of interactive element. So again, feel free, even if you have your video off, to jump in at particular moments. I think we want this to be very dialogic. And I think that that's also what sort of my remit from Sarah has been as well. But I do have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to jump in. But perhaps I should just say a bit about my background and locate myself, both as a person and as a scholar. I really enjoyed the way that the registration form asked us to locate ourselves in that way. So I should say that, I was born in New York in the States, to a father who's from Jamaica, who grew up in West Jamaica in Malvern, and a mother who is both of Black American and Bayesian descent. So this is where I locate myself, both within the region and outside the region. And then my scholarly work has been sort of focused on oil and gas politics in the Caribbean, with a focus on Trinidad and Tobago, where I've lived on and off for the past 15 years, conducting research on the project that became the petro-state masquerade. And I should say that the longest stretch was between 2014 and 2015, which also happens to be when I wrote the two pieces for Counterpunch that I shared for today. And a lot of this emerged in conversation with the Bolivarian Solidarity Committee in TNT that worked closely with the Venezuelan embassy in Trinidad. And here I'm relying a lot on comrades and scholars to offer a broad portrait of the oil war, right? Because my work has been centrally located in Trinidad and Tobago, but I'm really thinking about how we reached this particular inflection point in the oil war this January. Also, as sort of Sarah alluded to, I'm a sort of a scholar of Caribbean radical politics from especially the 1960s to the 1980s. And that forms a lot of the backdrop of today's teaching. So I want to begin with this question, and there'll be several questions throughout this presentation. What is socialism? What do we imagine when we say socialism? Any takers? Even one? It can be a very short answer even. If there are none, what I'll do is go to our first definition here. And I think what I like about this quote and this piece that I shared by Tim Hector from 1985 called What is Socialism? Indeed, that's the question that's orienting us today, is that this is not particularly familiar to many as the operative definition of socialism that we employ. So I want us to sort of inhabit this quote. There's another question of sort of who is Tim Hector? One of the reasons that I wanted to begin with Tim Hector is because this is, hosted by Intersect Antigua-Barbuda. Tim Hector is a socialist from Antigua. He also was a member of the Caribbean Conference Committee in Montreal that formed sort of a study group, and it invited CLR James to deliver a series of lectures and teach-ins that was collected by David Austin in this text, You Don't Play with Revolution. When Tim returned to Antigua, he also sort of founded and was one of the leaders of, and Alvet, Jeff is on the call and he can correct me on any of these points, the Antigua Caribbean Liberation Movement. He was deeply involved in radical politics there. They invited CLR to join them in Antigua and deliver a lecture in 1975. and maintained close links with the Grenada Revolution. So what's his definition of socialism here, right? He tells us a lot about what socialism is not. He says what socialism is not nationalization, it's not a vanguard party in power, it's not the commanding heights of the economy under state control. He even says socialism is not benefits for the masses. But what he does say is that socialism is the independent creative spirit. Sorry, excuse me, getting ahead of myself. Spirit of the massive population given the room and opportunity to create new institutions, right? So what is this independent creative spirit? This is something that comes right out of a Jamesian political tradition. But I'm also want to ask sort of why he's offering this definition of socialism in Antigua in 1985. Sort of what conditions is he responding to? Any takers?
The Grenada Revolution.
And what in particular about the Grenada Revolution, Christian? Thanks. Good to see you, Christian.
Yes. Like essentially the way in which the Vanguard Party started to like control the revolution and people were sort of cut out of the democratic process of the
Mhm.
revolution as time went on and the way it imploded. Yeah.
So Tim Hector knows this personally, right? He is familiar with the Grenada Revolution intimately, and he watched the collapse of the Grenada Revolution internally in 1983 that then led to, again, the US intervention and the collapse of the revolution in the final instance. Christian is alluding to, again, the particular vanguardist tendencies that led to the house arrest of Maurice Bishop. He's then sort of liberated from house arrest by the mass movement, and he's then assassinated by members of the Grenadian military. So this is one of the conditions that Hector's responding to. We can also say he's thinking about sort of the assassination of Walter Rodney in 1980. He maybe is also thinking about sort of this moment of perestroika in the Soviet Union, where there's a necessity of getting back to the question of how do we define socialism, and particularly what is the political horizon of socialism in a moment of retrenchment. Hector cites his comrade Yuzi Quayana as an inspiration for this piece. Can anyone tell me who Baba Yusi is? Any folks from Guyana on the call?
Yes, I'm from Guyana. And yes, so UC Quayana, who is now, I don't know, 90 something years old. He was an amazing political leader of Guyana, part of the PPP movement when it was a movement that was it was a joint independence movement. And then there was a split and he was part of that. And then eventually he was part of the Working People's Alliance, right? But he wrote widely. He was very, 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 very wise. And I just want to share something here. Because when in Guyana we were hearing about what was happening in Grenada, I remember you saying we were saying, and I remember him saying, ask them, where is Maurice Bishop? He kept saying, where is Maurice Bishop? In all the confusion, because I think he understood that this thing was imploding and Maurice Bishop was at risk. Mhm.
Precisely. And thank you for that summary. You've covered many of my notes. I should say UC was born in Buxton, Guyana in 1935. He actually just celebrated his 100th birthday last year. And this is also to say, I want to share a sort of anecdote that when I spoke, UC's still kicking. So when I talked to him on the phone, I remember telling him about a podcast episode that I had recorded about the general strike in Trinidad in 1937. It's also the first chapter, the subject of the first chapter of my book. And UC tells me, oh, I remember that very well. I was 12. So when we think about who UC Quayana is, he's lived an entire life in politics, and very clearly, and again, to the sisters who just offered these comments, a life of self-criticism, that he never has remained within one political formation. He, again, was in sort of the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, then the PPP. When the PNC and Forbes Burnham breaks with the PPP, he's briefly a comrade of Burnham's before sort of leaving the Burnham Compact for the Working People's Alliance. In the WPA, he's a comrade, of course, of Walter Rodney. And here we have another definition, sort of what is Baba Yussi's answer to the question of what is socialism, right? And here he tells us a socialist movement may start with a small band, but along the route, it must become the movement of the majority of the population, must have a fair opportunity to impress their will, right? As he mentions, one of the main actors declared the October Revolution, and he's referring here to the Russian Revolution, could not be successful without the display of independent creative spirit by the majority of the population, and primarily the majority of the toilers. The Guyana experience has made this for me an unshakable rule, almost a dogma. Now, can anyone tell me what this Guyana experience he refers to is? And perhaps I've offered a clue in some of my remarks so far. Now I'll turn to our next slide. Perhaps this can illuminate for us. So I mentioned that one of Yussi's comrades in the WPA, of course, is Walter Rodney, who we all know very well. Rodney outlines the stakes here, that when he returns to Guyana, he says, for a small nation, Guyana has produced a discouragingly large number of lackeys and stooges who hide in the shadow of the comrade leader. And he says all of this, when he talked, this is from a speech called People's Power, No Dictator, a denunciation of the Burnham dictatorship. And he ends with, and all of this incidentally is carried on in the name of socialism. Now, in many respects, we don't think of Forbes Burnham as a socialist, but this is precisely what he was styling himself as in this political moment. The country of Guyana is formally, right, in formal terms, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And this takes shape under Burnham. And Rodney, Koyana, and others are suggesting that this is actually Burnham enacting a masquerade. He is no socialist at heart. And in fact, there needs to be a corrective from the workers themselves, from the Working People's Alliance, on what the horizon of socialism must be. I also want to note that this speech is delivered just several months after the New Jewel movement seizes power in Grenada. So there is an active socialist project, another socialist project that's unfolding in the region at this time. Yet Rodney still insists that this is precisely the time that we need to be critical of what socialism is. We need to be very clear about what we mean when we articulate our desire for socialism, when we articulate the project of building socialism. Yussi makes reference to this point, as well as Tim Hector, that nationalization alone is not socialism. State control is not socialism. Why do we believe that's not the case? And perhaps how does the Guyana experience help us illuminate this? Is anyone familiar with this book? I always keep my copy close by, which is also written by Yussi Koyana. So the bauxite strike and the old politics is responding to and thinking through the significance of the wildcat strikes of bauxite workers in Linden, Guyana. And this is after the bauxite industry, or in particular, the Demerara Bauxite Company, has been nationalized by the Burnham government, right? What is a wildcat strike? A wildcat strike is when workers stop work, go on strike without authorization of their union officials. They're working independently of the union. Yussi outlines here the question of where is the state and its central government located in Guyana? Anyone who knows Guyana well knows that the government, the state, is concentrated, the central government, on the coast in Georgetown. Now, Linden, where the bauxite strikes are emerging, is located upriver, right? This is in a distinct location from where the state is concentrated. So with nationalization in this sector, union chiefs and labor leaders in the bauxite sector begin moving from the bauxite mining regions upriver to the coast, where they take up offices effectively next door to company management. So this is also a question about where is socialism? Is socialism located in the offices of union bureaucrats in Georgetown? Is it located within the bastions of workers' self-activity in Linden and in the interior? This is precisely what Yusi's responding to, and he's saying that it's the workers who are demonstrating this, right? They're the ones who are enacting the wildcat strike in response to these conditions. Now, one more sort of definition, if you'll indulge me. Who can tell me who Andaye is? Once again, I'm looking at the Guyanese contingent. Yes.
I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in here, but being Guyanese again and having known Andai for many, many years, Andai was Guyanese. She worked and in many, many areas. She was a member of the WPA. She was an amazing thinker. And while in the WPA, one of the things that became apparent in Guyana, in the Guyana context, is that having something like a women's political arm made no sense because the country was so divided racially at that point. And there was a need for women to organize and be part of, an organization, a group, and so on, outside of the formation of political parties because it distorted women and all the problems that they faced, regardless of which party it was. So Red Thread was born out of that, and there was a conscious decision at that point to work both in Afro-Guyanese community and Indo-Guyanese community, and to try and bring women together so that they understood conditions which they shared and they had to struggle against and overcome. I would just say that, but she was an amazing person.
That's spot on. So thank you for that. The only things I'll add to sort of your genealogy of Ndaye, which is that she sort of was a founder of Red Thread, a comrade in the Working People's Alliance, also again, a close sort of interlocutor of the Grenada Revolution. She's also very active in the sort of global women's strike or the Wages for Housework campaign. And I want us to look at this quote here and what it offers to our definition of socialism. Here, Ndai is thinking about the political role of the housewife, right, as a social formation. She says, left-wing parties and feminists have in different ways underestimated the power of housewives. And in bold print, the left explicitly sees housewives as isolated and therefore lacking in what they understand to be consciousness, even though housework is seldom an isolated or isolating activity. And she ends, there is no frontier between home and street. So Ndai is saying that not only is the household a space of work, a space of proletarian consciousness, it's also the site of an insurgent political imagination. She's trying to break down this arbitrary and artificial boundary between home and the street. And here she's responding to sort of a series of sort of food, we could call them food riots or responses to restrictions on certain food imports that are imposed by the Burnham regime in 1982 and 1983, in which, again, sort of housewives alongside bauxite workers and sugar workers are very much taking the lead in this revolutionary moment. So we can think again about sort of what is the conjuncture of 1983 raising? How do we see sort of the independent activity of working people? And that's working people both inside and outside the home, taking shape at this moment. We're going to come back to this later. We're going to turn to Venezuela now. So this is question of what was the Caracazo? I'm actually just going to offer a brief summary here. This is a quote from the Venezuelan anthropologist Fernando Coronel. He happened to be trained in this department where I'm speaking from currently. And he says, on February 27, 1989, masses of people took over the streets of most of Venezuela's major cities, protesting increasing prices and looting stores. And he talks about, again, the suppression of this spontaneous, independent uprising by the Venezuelan state under Carlos Andres Perez. I want to also note that this was in response to the removal of fuel subsidies, and which led to a 100% increase in the price of consumer gasoline. It also meant increases in bus fares, right, that impacted working people directly. So a lot of the spontaneous resistance of the Caracazo, right, that takes shape in Greater Caracas, involves rioting, but also specifically the burning of buses. But it's also a rebellion that's national in scope, right? That this is not limited to Caracas. So actually the term Caracazo is a bit misleading. It's suppressed by state violence. You know, many are left dead, right? And Coronel is sort of questioning the official casualty count. But what it does is that it demonstrates the consciousness of the masses and the independent creative spirit that, again, Hector Quayana and Ndaye and Walter Rodney are alerting us to. And in this way, I think the Caracazo deserves to be understood alongside something like the general strike of 1905 in Russia, right? Where workers independently form themselves into Soviets, into workers' councils. And this spontaneous activity leads to a shift in theory and organizational practice for someone like Lenin, right? At that moment, Lenin is not thinking about a socialist or workers' revolution in Russia. He has his eyes on a bourgeois revolution, which is to say that he's thinking about the stages that Russia will have to pass through as a so-called backwards country in order to achieve socialism. But the general strike in 1905 changes this fundamentally. When he sees the capacity of the workers being demonstrated, he shifts his orientation toward the possibility of workers' revolution, right? We could think about other moments in the history of our region that signal something of the same order, right? We could think about, for instance, the general strike of 1937 in Trinidad, right? That when I say it emerges spontaneously, it's not that the workers themselves are not organized. It's that they're doing it independent of, for instance, the Trinidad Working Men's Association, which is telling them explicitly not to go on strike, not to put down their tools. You can also think about something like Bois Caiman, right? The ceremony that launches the Haitian Revolution in 1791 as yet another moment that indicates the level of consciousness that workers themselves have reached. And that creates the necessity of revising our existing theory in much the way that Lenin does in 1905. So what is Chavismo? Perhaps we can add to this, who is Hugo Chavez? I think many of us on this call are familiar with Hugo Chavez and who he is. So what I'm actually going to do is read a direct quote that, again, Fernando Coronel is relating this to the experience of Chavismo as a political process. And he says, the Caracazo for Hugo Chavez symbolized the profound injustices and political failure that his movement would overcome, right? That Chavez understands that the Caracazo demonstrates the capacity that ordinary workers have. It demonstrates their political will, if we're taking the term from Yusi Quayana. And this is what fuels his own kind of political consciousness as an officer in the Venezuelan military. So we can trace a sort of very brief timeline of Chavez and the emergence of Chavismo, right? In 1992, as a military officer, Chavez embarks on a failed coup attempt against the Perez government in Venezuela. He's subsequently jailed This emerged after he had built a sort of clandestine organization within the military ranks that was aimed at sort of promoting a revolutionary upheaval. He's released from prison and runs successfully in democratic elections. And he's elected president of Venezuela in 1998. And then in 2002, there is a coup attempt against Chavez that at least briefly removes him from office. He's held in sort of military captivity. But as we remember, Chavez is a military officer and a very popular one. So there's an effort to create a narrative, and many called the 2002 coup attempt the media coup because many sort of Western media outlets basically sort of suggested that the coup was already complete. They wanted to assert that Chavez had a fall from grace and was deeply unpopular. But what happens instead? What we see in 2002 is that the very same forces that launched the Caracazo in 1989, 13 years before, restore Chavez to power by demonstrating their power in the streets. They take to the streets in defense of Chavez's political program. And again, they demonstrate quite clearly here something that is a sort of aphorism of someone like CLR James, which is that the real source of power is in the mass movement, right? This project of Chavismo will proceed as far as the mass movement takes it, because they ensure that even against these attempted coups, he will remain at the sort of the vanguard of this project. They have established that rather than himself. So during Chavez's years in power, he embarks on a series of progressive social democratic reforms, both domestically and internationally. I think many of you will be familiar with many of these, both sort of anti-poverty and infrastructure programs that form the foundation of Plan Bolivar. Constitutional reform, so they sort of draft an entirely new constitution that also christens Venezuela as the Bolivarian Republic in 1999. We see the sort of the further nationalization of the oil sector. I think it's important to say that the oil sector was already partially nationalized under Perez, so under a deeply unpopular dictator, right? So just like we saw with Burnham and Guyana, nationalization itself does not equal socialism. There's clearly something else that Chavez, Quijana, and Daye, Rodney are after here. Also, two for sort of very signature programs of Chavez's administration are sort of the low-cost heating oil that's extended to low-income Black and Indigenous communities in the United States, as well as another sort of program called Petro-Caribe, which is also probably familiar to many on the call here today. So Petro-Caribe in particular runs in its sort of formative period from 2005 to 2019. And it's premised on low-cost oil deliveries with preferential repayment terms that are offered to effectively sort of Caribbean nation states. And you could see, again, on this infographic, the particular countries that were participants in this program. It also involved a number of sort of preferential infrastructure financing programs through ALBA as well as Petro-Caribe that created a number of signature projects. And I think, again, for those folks who are dwelling in CARICOM countries and are logging on from CARICOM countries, you may remember specific projects that emerged out of this moment and out of the Petro-Caribe Compact. Now, one of the questions is, why was this so important for the Caribbean in this moment? Part of the reason is that most of the Caribbean is oil dependent, right? That they are oil importing nations. And many are very dependent on crude oil for things as elemental as electricity and power generation. So particularly at a moment, and again, I mentioned sort of 2005 to 2019, when oil markets are continuing to rise in response to things like the US invasion of Iraq. This means that the sort of balance of payments is actually sort of is cutting against the Caribbean, right? it's very difficult to sort of meet the balance of payments and meet their energy needs. So this provides an essential sort of moment of relief. There's also the question of sort of what allowed Chavismo to be successful in this period. What allowed this benevolence toward the Caribbean, toward low income and sort of racialized communities in the United States? What allowed this project to be successful? Much of this emerged out of this a very long-standing project in Venezuela of sowing the oil, right? This was true also under Perez, where sowing the oil was about creating revenue for the state, but then you could invest into other kinds of sectors. But Chavez is thinking about so he's thinking about anti-poverty programs, he's thinking about working class programs and reforms in a way that's shifting the terrain or the focus of this extractive project or neo-extractivismo. Part of what Chavismo benefits from is advantageous markets for oil. So what is a very difficult moment for much of the Caribbean as oil importing nations is actually a boon to oil exporting nations and producing nations like Venezuela, and in some respects also a place like Trinidad and Tobago. He's also able to be successful because U.S. refineries, and particularly refiners in the Gulf region, are very dependent on Venezuelan crude. So is anyone on the call can anyone tell me what type of crude Venezuelan crude oil is? So there are several types of crude oil, right? When you talk to folks in the oil and gas industry, they'll say, there's the light and sweet crudes from Saudi Arabia, for instance, which means that they are less dense and have less sulfur content. So light meaning less dense, sweet meaning less sulfur content. Venezuelan oil is notorious for being heavy and sour, meaning it's extremely dense, right? It's almost like if anyone from Trinidad knows the Pitch Lake, right? It's almost the consistency of lake asphalt, right? And also is a very sour crude, meaning that it has a high sulfur content. U.S. refineries in the Gulf were designed for this type of crude because Venezuela had it in abundance, right? This means then that, Venezuela holds a lot of power within this energy matrix. The U.S. refiners need Venezuela. They can't do without it. We also, at this moment, there are there's only a limited advent of unconventional techniques for extracting oil. So this is a moment of conventional oil extraction, which involves, again, sort of onshore extraction as well as offshore. But we haven't seen the advent of novel forms of extraction, like, for instance, shale or hydraulic fracturing that emerges in the United States, and not to the extent of deep water oil extraction that we now see today. So part of the question is, at this juncture, at this very successful moment in Chavismo, in the Bolivarian Revolutionary Project, is this socialism, right? We could think about this against the definition that Hector and others offered at the beginning of this presentation. But also for Chavez, is this socialism, right? Chavez has always talked about this revolutionary process of building socialism. So let's think about what Chavez himself has to say. This leads me to my next question. Sort of what is the commune? In one of his final statements before his death in 2013, Hugo Chavez declares this, comuna or nada, commune or nothing. What does this tell us about his definition of socialism? So what is the horizon of socialism in Venezuela for Chavez? Is it state control of the economy? Is it benefits for the masses? Which he has achieved both at this point. But yet he's saying this statement. He's saying comuna or nada, meaning we're going to have the commune, we're going to sort of entrench the communal state, or this project will be nothing. I think that's very telling. we think about what is a commune, right? A commune is a self-governing assembly, collective. We can liken it again to the Soviet being a workers' council, a workers' cooperative that emerged spontaneously in the general strike in 1905 in Russia and resurfaces in 1917 as one of the sort of events that sparked the Russian Revolution. We can also think of this as, again, sort of a community assembly. And many of you will know that the Grenada Revolution emerges out of a movement called the Movement for Assemblies of the People that was spearheaded in no small part by a figure like Franklin Harvey, who was originally from Trinidad and Tobago, I believe of Grenadian ancestry. And Harvey was one of the members of the same Montreal collective alongside Tim Hector that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So the commune form, in many respects, and we're going to try to think about what the commune form is the horizon of socialism for Hugo Chavez. That's what it must be. So all of this to this point is about how do we then instantiate the communal state or build the commune. And I just want to point us to a couple quotes from Gio Maher, who wrote two fantastic books about Venezuela, but one called We Created Chavez and another called Building the Commune. And here, this is from 2016. He's assessing sort of what the communes that are being formed in Venezuela are and what they've achieved. And he says the communes are an ambitious attempt to reverse this trajectory by encouraging self-managed production geared toward what people actually need on the local level, right? And he also emphasized that this is about decentralizing both the sort of burden of production as well as the burden of governance, right? This is about sort of creating a new governing structure for socialism in Venezuela. I want us to turn to, this is from, after the US invasion of Caracas this year, where he's now sort of reflecting on some of the challenges that were faced in building the commune, because this is not a simple process. This is not an easy process. The communes don't emerge simply because you say all power to the communes, simply because you say the commune or nothing, right? And I just want to flag here that Gio's also thinking about both the struggles that the commune faced under sort of sanctions and imperialist subversion, right? When the economy was bad, so to speak, in recent years, but also some of the difficulties it faced when the economy was quite good. And he says here, when there was lots of oil money circulating, Chavismo was able to, and in fact did, dedicate significant resources to supporting and funding the expansion of communal production. But much like we see in the US nonprofit sector, this can also lead to what economists would call rent-seeking behavior, with communes forming because of the resources available and the needs of the government rather than their own needs. So this, again, is one of the, I think, is a really sort of honest assessment of thinking about the challenges of building the communal state. So this is the horizon, but again, this is why you don't play with revolution. This is why revolution does not come easily. So here I want to turn to this discussion of the oil war, which we'll get to in a moment. But first I have to ask sort of, what is oil? This is something I ask in several of my classes, and sometimes it's a bit more challenging than we might expect. We think we know what oil is, but what is oil? Can anybody offer? Do I have any takers?
We have a response in the chat.
I see Gabriel has his hand up as well. Gabriel, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, sure, why not? Just of like common understanding, oil is a fossil fuel that is used to produce electricity. It's one of like the most widely used fossil fuels. It's a non-renewable resource, even though that is like questionable in certain masquerades of, argued against its non-renewability. But yeah, I guess like, common understanding, it's a petrochemical resource.
So I would just add to that, thank you for that, Gabriel, that oil is a hydrocarbon that exists naturally in liquid form. It's a concentrated store of carbon energy that is based on, again, sort of the remnants of prior organic life. A lot of times in the oil industry, they'll talk about the dinosaurs beneath the surface, right, that need to be extracted. There is something that is distinctive about oil as a carbon energy resource. So, unlike coal, in order to be used in these applications, like Gabriel is saying, of gasoline and power generation, in petrochemical development processes, oil has to be refined. So, when we talk about the distinct phases of oil and gas production. In the industry, they'll talk about these three distinct phases of upstream, midstream, and downstream, right? Upstream is the primary extraction of oil, which is a hydrocarbon that's naturally in liquid form, or natural gas, which is a hydrocarbon that exists naturally in a gaseous state. The midstream refers to the transportation of these primary resources to downstream sites of refining, processing, and the production of finished products. So the midstream here, usually takes shape around, you see they have both a sort of tanker ship as well as a tanker truck, but also via pipelines, right? That pipelines are one of the key conduits that allow this industry to thrive. Now, I want to ask at this point, do we remember what type of crude oil U.S. refineries were designed to process in the Gulf, which was Venezuelan crude, right? The sort of heavy, sour crude. So we're going to return to this shortly. So now I'll pose the question that you all came here for. So what is the oil war? And particularly, what is the oil war in the Americas? Because again, at the time that I was writing the piece called Oil War in the Americas in 2014, we were very accustomed to the idea of wars fought over oil, right? There was all this discussion about, for instance, the US invasion of Iraq as an oil war. What we were not accustomed to was talking about what was happening in the Americas as a war, right? Now in January 2026, perhaps we could say, yes, this is a war. But my argument was this actually began more than 10 years ago. And I want to talk about what the contours and histories of this oil war are. So where does it begin? How is it waged? And particularly, how did US empire respond to the Bolivarian Revolution? And just a little sort of offering here. Let's remember this, because at this point, I'm trying to convey also, and because I was there in many respects, and I watched this process very eagerly when I was a young comrade in high school and as an undergraduate, when the Bolivarian Project was at its heights. So the question then becomes, as C.L.R. James puts it here, this is an extract from Notes on Dialectics that he wrote in 1948. He says, each successive stage is more and more counter-revolutionary because capital is more and more counter-revolutionary. So this is the premise. What was the nature of the counter-revolution? You all may know who this is, correct? Everyone remembers, and once again, I'm placing myself back in the moment of Barack Obama is elected president of the United States in 2008. Does anyone know what Obama's energy policy was, or what it was referred to as when he took office in Washington? So Obama's policy was known as the all of the above policy, which meant that he was advocating for investments and capital to be sort of placed into renewables like solar, wind, hydropower, nuclear, But he also insisted that oil and gas would play a key role in this process, right? Here, this is from 2016, where natural gas became one of the key sort of substrates of his energy policy. And it was being promoted, and still to this day is often promoted as a bridge fuel or a transition fuel, right? They say it has sort of less greenhouse emissions than crude oil, which is correct, right? But he's also saying here we can't just shut off fossil fuels. We've got to live in the real world. So this is, in essence, Obama's energy policy. This is one of the transformations that's happening at this time. Can anyone tell me what we see in this image? Can anyone guess where this image is from? So this image is from West Canada, specifically Alberta. And this is an image of a tar sands oil pit mine, right? What are tar sands, right? Tar sands are an unconventional technique of extracting crude oil from oil sands, right? Now, I was about to ask sort of what type of crude oil is produced in Alberta? Can anyone maybe guess, even if you don't know what kind of oil is being produced here? And we talked about, the light sweet crudes, the heavy sour crudes. Anyone want to wager a guess? It so happens that the oil sands in West Canada are also heavy sour crudes, much like the oil that's produced in Venezuela, right? So if we think about what do refiners on the US Gulf Coast, what do they want? They want a steady supply of oil that they can process in their facilities. But clearly, there's a desire now to isolate Venezuela in this process. And this is part of what I was writing about back in 2014. So the key then becomes, how do they get the heavy sour crudes from West Canada as a way to replace their dependence on Venezuelan crude oil? And again, the dependence was something that Chavez and Chavismo benefited from. And it was very important to the success of the revolutionary project to that point. Does anyone recognize this image? Does anyone remember this moment? Who can tell me what this is?
Was this Dakota Access Pipeline?
Yes, it is. So this is, Standing Rock. So we have the sign on the street sign saying leaving Standing Rock Indian Reservation. These were the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline that occurred in 2016 to 2017. Now, what does this have to do with Venezuela? Does anyone have a thought? Can anyone? Yes? So let's remember here, Obama's energy policy is the all the above policy. Yes, Gabriel, go ahead.
Just like taking a stab at it, like the Dakota Access Pipeline would have been almost a response to Venezuelan like oil production and oil patronage of the Caribbean, giving the US more access and more ready access to oil and natural gas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is correct. The key to this story here is that the Dakota Access Pipeline emerges in response to yet another unconventional frontier of oil and gas extraction. This is specifically the shale oil basin of the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. So these hydraulic fracturing techniques or fracking techniques are creating sort of new access to previously sort of inaccessible or uneconomic reserves of oil in North America. Now, in this case, the Bakken Shale produces light, sweet crude. So this is not going to help the refiners on the Gulf Coast. But what it does is, again, it is creating a moment in which the US is emerging now, again, as a net exporter, a net producer of oil and gas resources, as well as we're seeing, again, sort of the overproduction of oil globally, right? Which is having the effect of driving down market prices for oil and gas. And we're going to come back to this in just a moment. There's another pipeline project that you may be familiar with around this time, the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, what kind of oil was the Keystone XL designed to transport or proposed to transport? I'll answer it for you because I think in some ways, after what we've discussed a couple slides ago, it's self-explanatory. If the Keystone XL pipeline is designed to bring crude oil from the sort of West Canada tar sands mines to the United States, this is about sort of transporting heavy sour crude from West Canada. Now, why is this sort of, the Keystone XL is about expanding the capacity to move tar sands oil. They already had, again, as you see, existing pipelines that did this, but the expansion was critical for US refiners on the Gulf Coast. They wanted to replace Venezuelan crude, and they were able to do so by again, sort of swapping Venezuelan crude for Canadian tar sands oil. And in many respects, that's what US Gulf refiners are refining today. Although now, again, we're in a new moment where the Venezuelan oil may be back on stream, which we'll talk about in a bit. I point this out in the introduction to my book, right? I mentioned this from the former CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, who, not for nothing, was also the Secretary of Energy in Trump's first administration. And I say that in 2014, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson forecasted worldwide deepwater production to grow 150% by 2040. Alongside the extractive innovations of North American shale and Canadian tar sands, Tillerson's mantra of going deeper promised to unlock new reserves in perpetuity. And in some ways, this speaks to what Gabriel was saying about oil and gas are non-renewable resources. But when they continue to find new frontiers, new reserves of oil and gas in sort of unconventional forms, that now they have novel technologies and ways to extract more efficiently and more and less expensively, this shifts the entire geography of oil and gas production. Suddenly, again, as I say, we see sort of oil and gas production in places like the Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas, in North Dakota, in the sort of West Canada tar sands in Alberta. We see deep water oil and gas activity globally exploding in places like the Caribbean, which again, we will get to in just a moment. So the fact that there's all of these new sites of production means that there is far more supply than there was previously. And what effect did these new frontiers have on global oil prices? We can see here again, sort of this graph shows us in many respects the acute phase of the Bolivarian Revolution, right? Remember, Chavez is elected president in 1998, and look at the way that this graph continues to rise from that point until 2008. Before the financial collapse in 2008, oil and gas, the market prices for oil and gas peak at just above $125 US per barrel. Before, again, you see it sort of drop at the moment of the financial crisis and then continue to rise again. So we see sort of another peak in June 2014 at just over $108 per barrel. Now, with the advent of these new sort of extractive techniques, and think again, this is in the sort of latter years of the Obama administration, his 8 years in power. the advent of the shale revolution, the advent of these new sort of frontiers of oil and gas creates a sort of a glut in global oil supplies, meaning an oversupply. In fact, they're starting to run out of storage for these excess oil and gas resources. In January 2016, the price of oil drops to $27 per barrel. So the question is sort of what impact did this have on the Caribbean? How did Washington in general respond to PetroCaribe, right? And the extraordinary success of that program for Caribbean nation states. This photo from January 2015. So think about this. This is right as we're, in the same conjuncture as Standing Rock. We see Joe Biden, as vice president, convenes this Caribbean Energy Security Summit. And all of you logging on from the Caribbean may recognize some familiar faces here. I mean, I see Kamala, I see Portia, I see Gaston Brown, several others, correct. So they're gathering all of these Caribbean heads of state in Washington to discuss what they're calling Caribbean energy security. What they do within this summit and the broader sort of the broader sort of U.S. Caribbean energy compact is encourage Caribbean nation states to transition from crude oil to natural gas for power generation. And they say, in particular, this is about moving to a cleaner energy source. Remember, I said natural gas for Obama is being touted as a transition fuel, as a bridge fuel, as a cleaner, a cleaner form of hydrocarbon emissions. Why do we think they are doing this? Is it because they care so much about the environment and climate change? And if not, what do we think Biden and his boy Obama are after in this moment? Who produces natural gas or LNG in the Western Hemisphere in, let's say, the 1990s into the 2000s?
B also said in the comments or the chat what I was thinking, which is to pull the Caribbean away from being reliant on Venezuelan oil to using the new, I guess, sources of oil that are being found in the US.
So part of this is correct. We now see that the US is producing natural gas because many of these shale reservoirs are also gas reservoirs. So you have shale oil, you also have shale gas. There's another place where the LNG business, especially in the early aughts, is booming at this moment. So, Gabriel, go ahead.
Trinidad and Tobago.
Correct. So, any of you who are familiar with Trinidad and Tobago know about the presence of Atlantic LNG in Point Fortin. And this is one of the signature projects of Patrick Manning's administration. It begins when a small sort of natural gas company in Boston, Massachusetts called Cabot LNG approaches the Trinidad and Tobago government in 1992 about a gas liquefaction facility. And ultimately, this becomes a joint project of Cabot, of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as several other energy multinationals. And Trinidad becomes one of the largest, at that point, exporters of LNG in the Western Hemisphere. This is a quote from my sort of oil war piece in 2014. And this is the point that I'm conveying here today as well, that at this moment, energy security in the US, which is what they were sort of touting in all of these summits and declarations, was a matter of promoting viable alternatives to Venezuelan socialism, that is to say, Venezuelan oil, as much as identifying reliable sources of oil. So again, Obama's all the above policy, which I've mentioned. And I sort of conclude by saying this concern for Caribbean energy security is motivated by an effort to provide alternatives to PetroCaribe and ease an eventual transition from socialism to neoliberalism in Venezuela among its regional interlocutors. So here, one of the troubles that they run into is that Trinidad and Tobago is going through a decline in upstream oil and gas activity, that they're not producing enough natural gas to then supply the downstream facilities, the LNG facility at Atlantic in Point Fortin. So this is an extract from, I'm trying to remember which piece this is from, but where I'm looking at the WikiLeaks cable. I think this year is incorrect. I think it's from the 2014 piece. And this is related to WikiLeaks cables that were talking about Petrocaribe and the US government's, the State Department's response. Dispatches from the US Embassy in Jamaica decried the inaction of leading Caribbean oil and gas producer Trinidad and Tobago to quell Venezuelan influence, which in the face of rising oil price pushed the region into Chavez's arms. So this is the concern that the US has at that moment, right? And I believe those WikiLeaks cables are from an earlier moment, I believe around 2010. Later, again, we're seeing now the advent of the US as an oil and gas producer through these shale patches. So suddenly, again, the preoccupation with transitioning the Caribbean from oil to natural gas as a source of power generation becomes part of their program to isolate Venezuela. So this oil war is proceeding through the entire Obama presidency as well. Now, what is pictured here? We talked about these unconventional oil and gas frontiers. Can anyone tell
Floating
me?
platform,
Yes, this is the
floating platform,
this is the
right?
live. Go
Offshore
ahead.
oil drilling, storage, etc.
So this is correct. This is in Guyana's offshore. This is the Liza Destiny drill ship, right? A drill ship is an autonomous vessel. It can move on its own, but is equipped with a drilling rig, both to explore for and extract oil and gas. In this case, this drill ship arrives in in Guyana in 2015 after the discovery by ExxonMobil of billions of barrels of offshore crude. So this forms yet another sort of element of this effort by the United States, not only to isolate Venezuela, but to make themselves less dependent on the oil and gas reserves of Venezuela, which I haven't mentioned, but again, in raw numbers, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. There's a question about, they're much more expensive and more difficult to extract than, say, Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, they have the largest reserves in the world. And the US and oil and gas companies are preoccupied with, if we're going to leave Venezuela behind, if we withdraw our capital in response to, for instance, many of Chavez's sort of a more aggressive nationalization policies, where are we going to go? And how are we going to continue to extract oil and gas and continue to make profits? So again, remember Rex Tillerson's mantra of going deeper, that going out into sort of deeper parts of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Basin in search of oil and gas is proving quite lucrative at this moment. And this is something that, again, I'm trying to convey here, that at the peak of the Bolivarian project, this earlier peak, it was very much unthinkable that Guyana would be a major player in the oil and gas industry. And I'm trying to say that this is one of the things that made, again, the counter-revolution so effective. This was in many respects not only implausible, but unthinkable for people like Chavez and for us, again, as observers. So one of the ways that US and I would say multinational oil and gas companies respond to this moment is by finding other ways to access the same hydrocarbon-rich geology that makes Venezuela the sort of leading holder of oil reserves in the world, right? As we know, for instance, Guyana shares a border with Venezuela. So quite literally, they share the same hydrocarbon-rich geology. I should add, too, that Trinidad and Tobago also shares this hydrocarbon-rich geology, in part because Trinidad as a landmass was originally part of the South American mainland, right? It's not an island, sort of a volcanic island or a limestone island in the same way as the rest of the archipelago. It's separated from the mainland by coastal erosion that creates, again, the serpent's mouth, the strait that sort of separates Trinidad from the South American mainland. So again, I'm thinking through here again that the U.S. multinationals and other, I would say multinationals, not simply from the U.S., are thinking about Guyana's oil reserves. I would add to that Suriname's oil reserves, Trinidad's oil reserves as a way to continue to extract hydrocarbons and profits. So I note here that even as it was unthinkable for us, the counter-revolution is already at work. So I mentioned that in the sort of the throes of the Bolivarian project, still Guyana's oil reserves were waiting in the wings. So as a WikiLeaks cable from February 2007 revealed, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there could be as much as 15 billion barrels of oil resources in Guyana's offshore waters, a resource that could transform Guyana in unimaginable ways if its border dispute with Venezuela is resolved. So this is the context that then we inherit in 2015. Now, we know that now Hugo Chavez has passed away in 2013. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, who's a bus driver turned politician, is now sort of is at the helm of the Bolivarian Republic. And the question now is, in this moment of counter-revolution, how did Maduro respond, right? I'll say this, when you go into the Venezuelan embassy in Trinidad, or imagine a Venezuelan embassy anywhere, you see a very different map of this region than you do, for instance, in schools throughout the Caribbean, right? And this is the map that you see, right? Where the Essequibo is carved out for Venezuela. So and reclamación, right? To reclaim the zone of the Essequibo as well as this offshore zone. So that entire sort of shaded area that juts out into the Caribbean Sea is also being claimed by Venezuela at this point. So the second piece that I shared, I'm responding to this moment and what is seen as a sort of moment of retrenchment, a moment of counter-revolution in the Bolivarian revolutionary project. And, this came in the form of both ExxonMobil's offshore ventures in Guyana, the withdrawal of multinationals from Venezuela toward new frontiers. But I also am really sort of pleased to see the fact that folks like Gio Maher, who, in recent weeks have begun to concur with my assessment of this moment that I sort of discussed in 2015, which is that I think that for Maduro, this was absolutely a strategic error. I think that this was a descent into jingoist nationalism that actually obscured the broader contours of the counter-revolutionary oil war. So this is what I had to say in 2015. The Bolivarian Revolution, by contrast, sprouted from a landscape of fossil fuel production, largely confined to conventional zones and methods of extraction. The Chavez doctrine, Chavez had never sort of tested the border issue. He basically had backed off the border question with Guyana, served a critical purpose during the revolution's formative years, insulating national oil interests via fiscal incentives and strategic diplomacy in the region. Thus, the rekindling of the border dispute with Guyana does not merely signal the departure of an erstwhile partner from the orbit of the Bolivarian Republic. There was a rice for oil agreement between Guyana and Venezuela, but the practical exhaustion of the Chavez doctrine as a blueprint for socialism. And again, like the Chavez doctrine is now being sort of replaced by something else. From its inception, the revolution was propped up by a commodity boom and an effective monopoly on the extractive capacity of the eastern Venezuela basin, Today, however, the Bolivarian Revolution faces the reality of an adverse market and competing sovereign claims to the hydrocarbons of the Essequibo. So again, I want to be precise here about sort of why I'm arguing this in 2015, which is basically that my assessment was this zona and reclamacion business is not going to save the revolution, right? What needs to happen again is sort of there needs to be a thinking about what is the revolutionary horizon and how do we tackle again the way that the counter-revolution is unfolding. It's also to say that this border issue is deeply complicated. I talk about this in the piece that, as we know, colonial borders are very arbitrary. No one can win in these border disputes. The way that the current border that, for instance, Guyana and others claim, so we can see that all of this here is claimed by Guyana. That border was set in a tribunal or arbitration between Venezuela and Guyana, where Guyana was represented by the British government because they were a British colony, and Venezuela was represented by the United States under the Monroe Doctrine. So in certain ways, these borders were set by no actors that we can reasonably or legitimately call Guyanese or Venezuelan. It means that these borders will always be arbitrary and subject to dispute. The question is sort of how can the Bolivarian Revolution respond at this moment, right? If they have no capacity to stop ExxonMobil short of an all-out military confrontation with the United States, then what do they do, right? And so my critique is fundamentally about the fact that instead of talking seriously to the Venezuelan people about the nature of the counter-revolution and what was being faced at this moment, there is an effort to sort of rally the Venezuelan people behind this claim to territory, this claim to Guyana that was never actually going to be resolved, short of a military conflict, short of a confrontation with actually the United States, who are protecting ExxonMobil's oil interests. So that's the question. Again, I'm very pleased to see folks like Gio have also said this in recent days, right? That this is one of the moments that we could say this was a strategic error. The question is sort of what should happen in the face of counter-revolution. Of course, what really lands the final blow here of the counter-revolution, of the oil war, are the expansion of sanctions, US sanctions on Venezuelan oil in 2017. Many folks have also sort of identified this as the starting point for the oil war, right? August 2017, this is now Trump's first administration. The US imposes financial sanctions on Venezuela that sort of prevents any company from doing business in Venezuela and also, again, sort of banking or doing business in the United States. And this is devastating for the Venezuelan economy. This is when we see, again, sort of shortages of essential goods and supplies. We see sort of out-migration in very large numbers throughout the hemisphere, right? Venezuelans are migrating throughout the hemisphere to places like Trinidad and Tobago, to the United States, to Mexico, to other parts of Colombia, to other parts of Latin America. So the reason I place this here is that I think it's very important, and what I've tried to lay out is that the oil war doesn't begin with Trump, and it doesn't begin with sanctions. Although, as I said, this is basically the right cross that followed the jab of these efforts to sort of launch new frontiers of oil and gas extraction. But again, when I was writing in 2014 and 2015, those sanctions, these new sanctions had not yet come into effect. Yet there clearly was an oil war already underway. And then Trump, again, sort of takes the mask off this entire operation. So I want us to think about this has become, since the US kidnapped Maduro and invaded Caracas in January, there's this new talk about a Monroe Doctrine, right? It's a play on words of the Monroe Doctrine, of course. let's talk about what we think the Monroe Doctrine is. And a lot of this remains to be sort of seen, articulated, but we know that the Monroe Doctrine refers to a policy of, we often euphemize as big stick diplomacy, the US sort of serving as a policeman of the Western Hemisphere, and particularly, the Roosevelt corollary to this, that there's sort of unilateral power for the US to intervene in hemispheric affairs that goes against its interests. Now, if we remember, I believe under Obama's perhaps second administration, Secretary of State John Kerry made a statement declaring the end of the Monroe Doctrine. Someone can look that up for me if they like. The question is sort of what then persisted after? My argument again is that this program of so-called soft imperialism was fundamentally a program of counter-revolution in the hemisphere. But then with the sort of Trump's election and with his return to office, we are seeing again sort of a return to some of the basic principles that underlie the Monroe Doctrine. But I still want to think about, and this is an image that Trump posted on his, I think, Truth social media account. This is not a real picture. This is an AI or some Photoshop that they put together of Trump holding court in the Oval Office with a number of European leaders and displaying this map of the hemisphere where you see Venezuela, Canada, Greenland, all sort of filled in with the US stars and stripes. So in some ways, we can think about this as like this photo as the founding document of a Monroe Doctrine. But I will say, if we think about and assess what happened in January in Caracas, Trump is adopting a bit of a different playbook from the one that many of us have grown familiar with, that we might associate with someone like Henry Kissinger, who basically governed bipartisan foreign policy for the US throughout the 20th and early 21st century. Trump is very sort of apt to cut off the king's head, so to speak. He wanted to remove Maduro. He created an entire media spectacle of this removal, right? Including the invasion of Caracas and sort of sharing video of the invasion itself, as well as, again, the frog march of Maduro in handcuffs across the United States in different, as he lands in different locations, and then he's booked in the Southern District of New York. What makes this different is that when this happened in January, I think we all anticipated that this would be a conventional and now very familiar regime change operation, that Trump and others in the State Department had been propping up the Venezuelan opposition for years in preparation for this moment. And this is the moment they would try to install a new leader. But this is not what they did. Instead, from within Washington, there were efforts to elevate a subordinate from within the party, from within the Socialist Party of Venezuela, and specifically Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. Now, this is very odd, right? For instance, there was in the anticipation of this invasion, there was a long-form profile on Rodriguez in the New York Times. This doesn't tell us about Rodriguez's own complicity or not in this. What it does tell us is what the US has designs on, specifically Trump and Marco Rubio in the State Department. Trump, in some ways, what he desires to do, what the Monroe Doctrine desires to do, is to conduct imperialism, but from within the ranks of socialism. And I think this is what makes it so odd for many of us, that what we always understood is that regime change is about removing the Socialist Party from power or removing the antagonistic party from power. But Trump, in some ways, understands something fundamental, perhaps that even his liberal counterparts didn't, which is what C.L.R. James told us, right? That, the real source of power is the mass movement. So when he says that his friend or former friend Machado in opposition, that she doesn't command any respect, and that's why she can't govern Venezuela, he's actually recognizing the fact that the real source of power is the mass movement. But there's an attempt now, or Trump and Rubio seem confident in their ability to appropriate the mass movement and particularly appropriate the Bolivarian project through a figure like Delcy Rodriguez. So much hangs in the balance in what Delcy Rodriguez chooses to do and how she chooses to respond to this moment. So how do we respond, right? How do we ensure the horizon of socialism, the horizon of the commune survives, and that not simply just a party in power survives, right? We don't want this simply to be a socialist masquerade. We want genuine socialism to continue to be built. I'll ask one final question here. I believe it's one final question. What is one-menism? Has anybody encountered this term before? I feel like Christian or Jeff, I might put them on the spot if they're still here. If they're not, one-menism is a term that sort of emerges out of Rastafari and Caribbean radical left movements in the 1970s. And I want to read this piece from Fundy, or Joseph Edwards, who was a Jamaican anarchist and refrigerator mechanic. I shouldn't say that. He said he's been accused of being an anarchist, but what he said is, "I'm for organization, man." So he's not technically an anarchist, right? So what Fundy says is, the New Jewel movement in Grenada was one of these groups which came out of this democratic tradition. In different countries, we were using different names about how this organization would be. You'd hear in the New Jewel movement the term people's assemblies. In Jamaica, you hear the term workers' councils. In Antigua and Trinidad, you hear community councils. And in other islands, similar democratic expressions, as opposed to the high-powered name of a centralized political power. So I want us to sort of focus on that final bit, that elsewhere, Fundy writes explicitly about this category of one-menism, or this practice of one-menism. And he's responding to what he sees as the problem of a political program that elevates simply a high-powered name of a centralized political power. Here, for instance, he's responding to what Christian sort of discussed earlier, the sort of devolving of the Grenada Revolutionary Project from the initial promise of the movement for assemblies of the people that sort of merges to become the New Jewel movement, into a sort of clandestine bureaucratic clique of, led by someone like Bernard Cord. So there's a lot of skepticism about both that model for Caribbean politics and Caribbean socialism, but also looking at its consequences. So what did it mean to sort of invest in one-menism? There's a longer story there, which is that, Cord actually launched the accusation of one-menism against Bishop because they had an agreement to share power between the two of them. To that, I would say that if we look at what Fundy is saying, he's also rejecting what we might call two-menism, right? He's saying that actually the response to one-menism is people's assemblies, workers' councils, community councils, the commune, the Soviet, not simply the sharing of power between two men. Now, I say all this also to, part of the remit of this meeting is to think about the sort of influence of Caribbean feminism on the definitions that we're offering. Now, can we think about a kind of feminist addendum to what Fundy is articulating here as a critique of one-menism? What would be a feminist response to one-menism, or why would there be a feminist response to one-menism?
I would say that by prioritizing one man's intellectual thoughts and then also symbolizing him, it inherently sidelines maybe the perspectives of women and then also other marginalized groups.
I think that's precisely it. And again, it also runs counter to the actual existing history of the Grenadian Revolution, right? When Ndiaye talks about the Grenadian Revolution, she talks about the sort of deep and profound participation of women, not simply in the, again, as our sister said, the women's wing of the revolutionary project, but fundamentally in the shaping of economic and political programs at the level of the sort of community or village assembly. So I think, again, we can think about this form of the commune, of the assembly, of the Soviet, and then consider sort of the kind of feminist bent that it also must take, which is that we're talking about a critique of one-manism, a critique of centralized political power as a necessity for the survival of a socialist project. But we can also think about sort of what will the character of that be? Will it simply be bauxite workers and sugar workers and oil workers who are often predominantly men organizing themselves into workplace committees? Or will it include, as Ndiaye said, again, the housewives, the domestics, the women in the service industry, in the clerical industry, also the unemployed, right? Unemployed people of all genders, right? I think this is the critique that we also have to launch. And this is something that we have to also take Fundy and others to task, many who we've read today, for not making that central to their critique. Now, why do we oppose one-manism, right? We oppose one-manism not out of a sort of utopian idealism. We oppose one-manism as a strategic necessity, right? This is something, can anyone tell me perhaps what they think the context behind this quote is? So we see it's a letter written from a French general, General Leclerc, who was based in what's then Saint-Domingue, what's today Haiti, to Napoleon. And this is around 1803, right? And as we all know this story well from James's The Black Jacobins, Toussaint is taken into custody. And this is in the moment where Napoleon is seeking to reinstitute slavery in the French colonies. They're successful. They successfully reinstitute slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique. But in Haiti, it launches this decisive war for independence, right? That, they will not be free under the French flag. They will not go back to slavery, but now they must be independent. And this is before the resolution of that conflict. But Leclerc says it's not enough to have taken away Toussaint. There are 2,000 leaders to be taken away. We have in Europe a false idea of the country in which we fight and the men whom we fight against. So as we know, Toussaint was captured. He was extradited to mainland France. He was imprisoned. And ultimately, he died in custody, right? What does this tell us? Do we see a parallel here? What is the parallel to today?
Venezuela.
Yes, Jeff. So we can think about, Maduro in this role of Toussaint. But again, the question James asked, did Toussaint make the revolution or did the revolution make Toussaint, right? Who launched the revolution? Who holds the power? The power remains in the mass movement. The power remains in the sort of thousands of unnamed, formerly enslaved people who launched this insurrection and insisted upon the necessity of their independence from France. So they would continue to be free. They would never go back to slavery. So this again, some might call it the many-headed hydra, right? Haiti couldn't afford to allow this project to collapse simply because Toussaint was kidnapped? This is the question that now faces us today. And this is also why, for instance, C.L.R. James keeps returning to this story of the Haitian Revolution throughout his life. He writes The Black Jacobins in 1938. He revises it in 1963. He lectures about it in 1971 and talks about how he would rewrite the story if he were to revisit it and begin from scratch, right? And he's doing that not because it's such a great and wonderful story, which it is. He's doing it to impart critical lessons about the moments that emerge in any revolutionary process and how we should respond. So I'm going to end here again. So what is socialism, right? And maybe I'll just conclude with a few words and we can open up for any discussion if we have time left. What socialism is, and let's say in Venezuela in particular today, is going to depend on the ability of someone like Delcy Rodriguez, her capacity to rally the forces of the Caracazo, the commune, the industrial workers, the housewives, the unemployed, toward this horizon of the commune during a time of retrenchment and imperialist détente, right? If we understand that that's where the power ultimately lies, will she be able to do this? Will the people be emboldened to do this? So what does our moment demand today for Venezuela, for the Caribbean, is ultimately this question of what is socialism, which is to say it's a question of power. Where does power rest? Does it rest simply within the party and its bureaucratic ranks? Or does it rest within the masses? And can the masses be mobilized toward this goal? And I think what I will say here, if I have any optimism anywhere, it's the fact that the social motion of ordinary people, of working people, will persist. The moment of the Caracazo it's an inflection point, but it's not exceptional. The moment of 1970 in Trinidad, the moment of 1937 in Trinidad, 38 in Jamaica, 35 in Guyana, 34 in St. Kitts, right? The uprisings in Curacao in 1969, right? These happen in flurries, right? So the mass movement, the power of the mass will continue to assert itself. The question is, how do we respond when they insist on continuing this horizon toward socialism? And by that, again, socialism meaning the commune, socialism meaning the assemblies, socialism meaning the free and creative activity of working people, and not simply a government that has the name socialist in its title. What the government will do in service of that, that's the open question today. So, will Chavismo today, as it continues to exist, and we should say it continues to exist, will it communicate its program to the mass base? Right now what we're seeing is a turn toward, again, privatization, which is continuing off of recent years. Delcy Rodriguez was the architect of the anti-bloqueo law, which was about privatizing state assets in the face of these sort of oppressive sanctions. What will be communicated to the masses about this program? Will they be told that, yes, again, the horizon will continue toward the commune? Will we continue to see, again, sort of the declaration of all power to the communes, comuna or nada, right? That's the open question that I'll leave you with. So thank you again.
That was wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Dr. Jobson. I want us to, if you can turn your cameras on, and if not, you can leave them off. But we want to open up for some questions. If you want to drop a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute, you can go right ahead.
First of all, this is Alva Jeffers.
Hey,
First of all, Yeah, I must congratulate you for the talk you just gave. And I want to preface my question by saying that the United States did not destroy the Grenadian Revolution. The revolution destroyed itself. United States just buried it. In that context, what did Maduro do to undermine the populist program of Chavez? No, I'm posing the question to you.
Jeff, can you repeat that? And also, can you introduce yourself briefly? I think it would be great for the benefit of the call to say a little bit about yourself.
Well, the only thing I could say is that I was a member of the Antigua-Caribbean Liberation Movement from about 1970 to 1979 before I left for the United States, and was a co-editor of the outlet newspaper. The question I'm posing to you is to tell us how Maduro undermined what Chavez was trying to institutionalize.
In a lot of ways, and I made my critique of Maduro's rhetoric and his sort of inflaming of the border issue with Guyana as a misstep. I actually don't think that we can attribute the decline of Chavismo to Maduro as a person or politician, right? Some may know more than me on that front. What I've tried to lay out in this presentation is the way that the objective conditions that he inherited were fundamentally different from the ones that Chavez inherited, and the ones that fueled this sort of initial probably two phases of the Bolivarian project. So I think his error, if anything, broadly, was failing to anticipate how deep and entrenched the counter-revolution would be, and failing to recognize where the counter-revolution would emerge from. So I think Chavez, as well as then Maduro, assumed that they would continue to hold hegemony over the entire sort of extractive potential of the Eastern Venezuela basin. And also, I think they believed that US refiners were so dependent on Venezuelan oil that they would never be able to enact the kind of sanctions that they did. Clearly that was wrong, but we were all wrong, right? Like when I say that it was unthinkable to us that Guyana would be a major oil producer, right? At the time that we're talking about. That's fundamentally true. And the problem, if anything, is that, the counter-revolution was more efficient. If you look at the cables, the WikiLeaks cables, they had their designs on Guyana in 2007, but we weren't alert to Guyana as a potential extractive frontier in 2007. So I think, if anything, that's a moment for self-reflection and self-criticism. I think in very much the spirit of Tim Hector, Yussi Koyana, and Daye, and also the comments that you offered here about Grenada, right? When we talk about Grenada, it's so crucial for us to maintain that self-criticism and also not reduce this simply to a conflict between two men and former childhood friends, Bishop and Cord. But again, the real problem that killed the Grenada Revolution was the failure to note that the real power lies in the mass movement. So when the mass movement went and said, we are going to liberate Bishop from house arrest, we're going to march with him back into town, the failure to recognize that that was a fundamentally political statement, and it was going to be not just disastrous, but fatal, again, to assassinate Bishop, regardless of what the agreement about power sharing was within the Central Committee. That's what it comes down to. And again, that's why we have to be deeply self-critical at this moment. So thank you, Jeff, for that. And I really appreciate you being here again with a number of really brilliant young people from Antigua. And I'm glad that you were here also to share that perspective as a veteran of the ACLM. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay,
But I did have a follow-up.
So do we have time?
we have about 5 more minutes and then we need to start wrapping up. So you can
Okay.
ask your question and
Great.
then we'll move on
Yes.
to the two others who have their hands up. But thank you so much for your perspective.
Or if somebody else have their hands up, let them go.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Jeff. Gabriel?
Hey, yeah, thank you so much for taking my question, and thank you to the former speaker for his question. So I was wondering, I think self-criticism is incredibly important when we're like thinking of building a real socialism and the communal and instigate and instantiating the communal form. However, like I think like from the talk, we also see the difficulty and truly like the impossibility of disconnecting the struggle for socialism and liberation from an international context. What makes this present assault on the Venezuelan project possible is a bunch of international, um, you know, things that occurred. I think we also see this with, I think right now we see a crisis of internationalism. The fact that we don't have internationalists. I'm sorry, I'll like hurry up, but I think I see it quickly. I see it very vividly in Gaza. I think, and I'll let like, the fighters themselves speak for themselves. But, I see like I see October 7th as almost a call or a rejection of the like idea that the Palestinian question is done or can be cast aside. And I see it as almost like a bugle call. Like, are you going to let them do this to us? Are you going to let them erase us? And right now we see it with Cuba, with the fall of Venezuela and the fall of and the embargo of Venezuelan oil that was helping the Cuban people. Like without Venezuela's allyship, we have seen Mexico kind of, make statements that are like, we're not going to abandon Cuba. But how does the Cuban project survive with no international protection or international help? And as much as, the masses of the Venezuelan people, I don't believe, like, I don't know much on the ground about Venezuela, but, even the mobilization of the masses can't stop the devastating effect of the sanctions. So like, we are in a moment where I think internationalism is lacking. And how do socialist projects and the people move in this kind of international climate? And how can we change this international climate?
Well, thank you, Gabriel. I mean, I agree that we are at a moment of a crisis of internationalism. And I think that one of the challenges of organizing like this in our region are sort of the limits of language, right? And there's been a lot of sort of sarcastic takes on social media about Trinidad becoming a bilingual state in the next, decade or two. And that would be an excellent development, right? To think about sort of creating more direct channels of communication between workers across the region, right? And I think that when we think about, again, this project that me and many others are evangelizing of a workers' federation from below, that's one of the key challenges that we face. Again, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything and again, to suggest that this project is going to be easy in the face of sanctions and imperialist, intervention. It's anything but, right? Like, you know, you don't build the commune by saying build the commune 10 times in the mirror, right? So the question is now, under these new conditions, under this Done Road doctrine, where, again, the PSUV remains in power, to what extent will this project of the commune continue? Will it find an anchor in this new moment where, we have a sort of new rapprochement between Washington and Caracas at some level? That's the question. I also think that it's important to note, and this has been mentioned in several commentaries and interviews elsewhere, that um, the Bolivarian Revolution, drawing on the energy of the Caracas, drawing the energy of the mass movement, has done something fundamental, which is that now it's even the Venezuelan opposition, the pro-imperialist opposition, can't return to some of their former policies that they supported, right? They are so profoundly unpopular, right? The idea that you would simply sort of liquidate the entire sort of social welfare state because people have accepted that as the new plateau, as the new sort of universal that they attach themselves to. That means that something has been incredibly successful about this. And again, sort of my point is that I think it's been incredibly successful because it's entrenched itself within the population. There's no going back. Think about Haiti in 1803. They've had their taste of freedom. They're not going back to what it was before. So that means even in the face of the counter-revolution is going to be fierce as it always is, as James says, it's always even fiercer, right? The question then becomes like, to what extent can we continue to ground and evangelize those forces that hold the power, right? Imperialists will continue to act like imperialists. They'll continue to impose sanctions. They'll continue to try to engage in subversive tactics. We have to be stronger because there's no other option, right? And we have to orient ourselves toward the horizon of what socialism is. But thank you, Gabriel. That's a really excellent question.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Jobson. We have time for one final question. I think, Lena, you had your hand up. And then, Cleon, if you're able to post your question in the chat, we will definitely get to it in a post-session reflection. I also shared a link to a feedback form. So if you can at least open the document and save it for later, that would be also really great. All right, go ahead.
Thanks for taking my question and for this really informative talk. I'll make it quick. So I know, Dr. Jobson, your area of expertise is, oil, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about Pax Silica, which is a new frontier. Like you mentioned, Guyana, people didn't really know we had oil. Pax Silica, for folks who might not be aware, refers to the rare earths, minerals that are used for AI and technology. And I wonder, there is some talk that is actually, what's going to overtake oil, or what's really going on behind the scenes. And people are like, we didn't pay attention to Guyana's oil. There's not the same level of attention being paid to the deals that are being struck and the countries that have that. And it's a new extractive model. So any thoughts about Pax Silica? Thanks.
I'll make my response very brief, which is to say that I think you have put it perfectly, Lena, which is to say that in the same way that we couldn't anticipate Guyana as a new oil frontier, and now in retrospect, we say sort of, what is it that we didn't know? What were we not alert to? I think that you've pointed out precisely one of the sort of theaters or frontiers that we should have our eyes and our attention fixated on. Because again, I said, the Don Rowe Doctrine, it doesn't seem to take on the same form that we're accustomed to. We all were ready for a particular kind of regime change operation. It's not what we received. And similarly, I think immediately we said, and Trump said out loud, this is all about Venezuela's oil, right? And we could say that that's a moment of just unadulterated honesty, a rare unadulterated honesty from Trump. But also we could ask, is that another sort of tacit deception? Because clearly it's partly about oil. But as you're saying, maybe there's something else beneath the surface. So I would just say, I encourage everyone on this call to investigate this to the furthest extent possible and then incorporate it into our politics. How are we organizing around this, right? So that's all I'll say, but thank you for that. I think that that's a real clarion call for all of us.
That was great. Thank you so much, everyone. Lucia, I'm going to turn over to you to deliver some thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, on behalf of the Intersect team, I'd like to thank our facilitator, Dr. Ryan Jobson, for leading such an illuminating and engaging discussion on labor, socialism, and the history and political economy of extractivism in the Caribbean region and the Americas. I'd like to thank our amazing co-founder, Sarah, for organizing today's much needed session. And I'd also like to thank all of our incredible participants for joining us, participating, and learning with us. The conversations that we had in this session have always been pertinent, but especially so now in the face of counter-revolution and as the US continues its aggressive encroachment on the region while our leaders sit back and let it happen. A better future, a revolutionary socialist future, requires creativity, self-reflection, and imagining a reality beyond our current circumstances. It requires us to reclaim our power as people, as the masses, and referring back to Uzi Quayana's words, embody an independent creative spirit. And I hope we leave this discussion today with these ideas in mind.
Thank you so much, Lucia. And once again, if we can have a virtual show of applause. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Alec Jeffers, for also joining us. It's an honor to meet you. Dr. Jobson, thank you. Thank you all for your questions. And thank you, Lucia, for designing the beautiful flyers and everything. We will be in touch with the recording of this session. We didn't get to some of your questions. We will respond to them in the post-session handout with Dr. Jobson will also be contributing to that. So thank you once again, and we'll see you once again soon.
Thank you.